Anybody else? Who don't know?
I'm a PSL teacher.
Oh, good. This is very relevant. I have been at McNeese now in January. It'll be 10 years. And as we said in the introduction, that I am the early childhood and reading program coordinator. We wear a lot of hats. What I'm going to talk to you about today is something that I learned after I've been teaching 15 years. I trained as a reading recovery teacher after 15 years in the classroom. I taught first grade for 12 years in 6th, 7th, and 8th, resource for 3 years prior to that. And after 15 years in the classroom, and I knew my students could read. When they left me, they could read. I mean, they weren't all on the same level, but they could read. And I knew that I knew how to teach reading. But what I didn't know is how to get them to take what they had learned with me and take it further. And it's that self-extending system. And so once I trained as a reading recovery teacher and I learned this, I began to think, why was this not in? Why is this something that I had never heard of before? And I had a master's in reading. Why had I not heard this? So when you see how simple it is, you're going to say the same thing. And so probably a lot of this you already know, but you're just going to see it presented in a little different way. So before I start, when a student or a child or a grandchild struggles to read and you're sitting there, what is the first thing that they come to a word they don't know? What is the first thing that we, the adult around them, says? Sound it out. Because how many of us in the classroom will talk to sound out? How many of us will talk phonics? Okay? Phonics is a wonderful thing. So please don't leave here and say that Dr. King said. Because what you're going to learn today is that I see phonics as a very integral part of teaching children to read. But I see it as part, a third of a part. And so that's what this is all about today. What I want you to do for just a minute is to think first about what your definition of reading is. And then after you do that, I want you to turn to a shoulder partner, and I want you to just briefly discuss what your definition of reading is. I will give you about 30 seconds, and when I want your attention, I will say class, and you will say yes. All right, so let's practice. Class.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so what I want you to do is turn to a shoulder partner, and I want you to just talk about what your definition of reading is. Okay? You may begin.
Reading is part of knowing what the words are, but also comprehending the context is also part of reading.
Got some real key pieces there. Yes?
Decoding symbols that represent sounds.
Okay. All right, good. And I like because we got two parts of it here. We're going to talk about that. And before I can teach you my quick little strategy, and I'm looking back here looking at Lacey, and she's just smiling. Bless her heart. I don't know how many classes she took me for. So this is Maury Clough, Reading Recovery, founder of Reading Recovery, and she defines reading as a message-getting, problem-solving activity that increases in power and flexibility the more it's used. There are three key components to this definition. Somebody just tell me one. Message-getting is what? Comprehension. And we heard that right there. What's another part? Problem-solving. So what do you think problem-solving is? What are we going to relate that to? Phonics, right. So there's something going on. We've got to do a little problem-solving. And then what's message getting, which is comprehension, problem-solving activity, so that tells you there's some interaction going there, and it can get better. It can get better. How's it going to get better?
Practice.
It's going to get better with practice. And it not only does it get better, it becomes flexible. So it gets stronger and it becomes flexible. So this is key. This is what I want you to keep in mind. And I keep notes, and I'll tell you why, and my students know that because I'm very passionate about things, and when I start talking, I have and with my age, I have a tendency to just take that tangent and go. And so I've learned that not everybody's interested in where I want to go. So it helps if I have my little cards. So first, let's look at reading in two parts. So first we have the mechanical part of reading. So what would you say the mechanical part of reading is? That problem solving. So that's going to be the what? The phonics. And then we have the thinking part of reading. And so the thinking part of reading is going to be the comprehension piece. That's right. So the mechanical part of reading, we believe, is learning to read. So our little people come in pre-K, K, 1 and 2, and we say that they're in that mechanical part of reading. They're learning to read. That's that phonics piece, right? And then we say that the thinking part of reading is where they, maybe not, where they read to learn. And so a thinking is, a theory is out there that first we have to learn the mechanical parts of reading, and then we're going to read to learn. Well, today what we want to do is briefly let's have a paradigm shift. I mean, we agree with this. We know we need phonics, and we know we need to comprehend. But let's just shift our paradigm a little bit. And I want you to think about reading in the context of reading to learn while learning to read. Okay? So what I want you to think about is from the beginning is that we are always teaching comprehension. Because what was the first thing Maury Clay said reading is? It's message getting. So it doesn't matter how good you decode. It does not matter how many words you can read. If you can't tell me what you read, if you can't discuss it, then are you reading? Well, there are people that say there's no such thing as word callers. I've been called out on that before in presentation. So, if there's anybody in here who can do that, let's just wait till it's over. But I think that my philosophy is, and I was just putting with all the children that I feel like that I did teach to read, that the key piece from the beginning is to make sure that they understand that reading is message getting. That's something from the beginning, and that goes back to when the kids are sitting on your lap, and you're looking at those pictures, and you're saying, what is he doing? What is that frog doing? What does he want? Look at his face. So what are we telling him? This isn't just words. This is conveying a message. So it's very important that we think about this at the beginning. So before I can teach you my quick little simple hand strategy, I have to talk to you about the key sources of information. So at the very beginning, I told you that phonics is 1/3 of what we do in the reading process. Okay? So phonics is what we call graphophonic information. It's visual information. How many of you have seen the key sources of information? I'm going to talk about them in just a minute. I'm going to give you 3, and I'll tell you they're semantic, syntactic, and graphophonic. And I actually have handouts for you afterwards. I don't give them to you first because then you'll know all the answers. And then here goes my presentation. So how many of you are familiar with this? The 3 key sources of information. Oh, good. I saw somebody raise their hand back there, and she happens to be a college professor. So we think about this. One is semantics. So semantics is meaning. All right? Where does meaning come from? Now let's just think about we have a book in front of us. Where does meaning come from?
The origins of language?
Okay, well, I probably turned it off. I did something. Okay. No, hold on.
You have a picture of your
Yeah, can you figure it out? Where does meaning come from? You said the origin of language. Okay, that's true, but when you're looking at a text, where does meaning come from?
She turned it off.
I did something with the clicker. My hand hit it.
There you go.
Okay, she said the author,
The context of the sentence.
the content, content, the actual print, the actual content of the story. Where else?
Illustrations.
The illustrations. Very good. So it comes from the illustration. What else? What about the title? Oh, yeah, didn't got that. I'll get back to it. So the next one is graphophonic, which is a visual, and then the third one is going to be syntactic, which is structure, and I'm going to go over each one of them. But let's go back. Where does meaning come from? Meaning comes from the picture cues. You know, a picture tells a story. Okay, but what happens as we progress? Okay, less pictures, right? But it also comes from the background knowledge of whatever it's about. So if we're reading about frogs, it's what do I know about frogs? And that's that background knowledge that allows me to develop that language that helps me to understand what maybe it's saying on this page. And then it's just this reader's sense of the story itself in the context. So all of this is where we draw meaning. And so that's why the beginning readers, how many of you have taught kindergarten or first grade? So you know that when you open up a book, you know, the very first thing you have to do is go through the book. You know, you just talk about the pictures, or you have to engage them in that background. If, where I'm from in Dry Creek, we don't see a lot of snow, and I'm talking about the Antarctic, what do I need to do? I've got to, and boy, today's teachers is so wonderful. You can just click on your you know, internet, and oh my gosh, we can take a hike in the Arctic or the Antarctic, right? So it's so important. All right, so then the next one is, I'm assuming it's going to go to graphophonic. The next one is graphophonic, and we said those are the visual cues. Where does that come from? What are the visual cues in the text?
Are you talking like punctuation and stuff? Is that what you're talking about?
Absolutely, absolutely.
The size of the font, the
Good. Oh, good. So what do we call those? What do we call the size of the font, the punctuation, left to right, directionality? What do we call that?
No.
Concepts about print. Okay, and you know, that's key. You know, how many of you are given a concept about print test? You know, where you ask them, show me the front of the book, you know, show me the left side, or show me where to start reading, which way do I go, return sweep. All of those things are part of the visual information, but there's more. Okay, so what about that letter-sound relationship? This is graphophonic, so we know that it's very important. It's not just that they know the letters, but it's that they have that letter-sound relationship. And then there's some known words, those sight words, that children pick up automatically when somebody's reading to them. And then, of course, the concepts of print that we just talked about, top to bottom, left to right, pictures carry meaning, all of those things, okay? All right, so then the last one is the syntactic, and that's the structure. And so we talked about language. So when we think about syntactic, the structure of the language, what comes to mind? Where do we pull that kind of information as a reader?
Grammar.
Your grammar, right. And then what else? You know, it's your knowledge of English as a whole. It's your knowledge of your natural language, you know, and how it sounds, okay? So when we're thinking about the structure, we're thinking about the knowledge of the language, and I can't spell the evidently. The story structure itself, you know, is it in poetic form? You know, how is it written? The grammatical structure, and then the language patterns themselves. So all of these things, when we look at these three key sources of information, this is what you do as a good reader every time you read. All of these things are working along seamlessly. You're not thinking about it, you're just doing it. Well, what happens with the struggling reader? One thing that we know about struggling readers that research bears out is that the first thing, struggling readers usually spend most of their time in small groups, and that is changing with RTI. That is changing, but usually spend most of their time in small groups, and they're doing worksheets, you know, or they're working on maybe with vowel sheets or something like that. So instead of reading and reading and reading, they're working on the mechanical part of reading. So that's saying to the reader, that's saying to the child that what's important is the phonetic part, is the mechanical part of reading. And yes, it is very, very important. But is it the only thing? No, but if that's what we stress from teachers get on board, and I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying I agree, but once teachers get on board and they learn how to make it work for those babies, those kids will get on board. It's just amazing how adaptable kids are. But, so the point is that that's what the child hears from, pre-K and kindergarten and first grade, and we're just pounding that. A can say A, and ah, and, those letter sound relationships, we stay on it, we stay on it, all these worksheets, and trust me, I spent a lot of years in first grade doing a lot of worksheets, I'm not really proud of some of that, but I had really good classroom management. So, anyway, I lost my train of thought, be very careful. So, my point here is that as good readers, this is seamless for us, but as struggling readers, and I don't know if anybody in here was a struggling reader, but let me tell you, I was. I was tutored in first grade, and it had to be like maybe 56, something like that. And tutored in first grade in phonics after school with my mother's cousin, who was a nun, and honey, she believed in phonics, but phonics didn't resonate. But I did eventually learn to read. I was, slow, got a little better as time went on. So I guess that's why this means so much to me, is because what I know is that it takes all of it now. And struggling readers tend to spend so much time on one part that's not working for them. And so as teachers, we have to step back and say, what can I do different? How can I make this better? Not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, not throwing out the phonics. It's just simply a matter of thinking of how we present it to the child. Because you all know that what you say in the classroom, that's what the child believes. How many of you try to help your children with homework at night? And you say, okay, this is the way you do it. Nope. That's not what Miss whatever said. I don't care what she said, it's the right answer. No, can't do it that way. Because you are so important to them. And that's why when we hear about, looking at the presentation before this, and you think, there's some people that don't love those kids. That's just hard. But anyway, so this is important for us to get to the next piece. All right? Before I talk to you about my low hand strategy, I have to give you a little bit of history. I told you I taught at this one school at East Beauregard for 15 years. It was 4 miles from my house. I applied for the reading recovery job. I don't know if you're familiar with it in some of your parishes, but it is a very, very successful program, but it is very expensive to implement. So they kept it for about 5 years, and then it went by the wayside. It was unfortunate, but it was my catalyst to become, to pursue a PhD and to be determined to work with college students. So it was good for the 5 years they did. But anyway, so I applied for the job and didn't get it. So I applied for it at another school in the parish, and then I had to drive 30 minutes. But it was good because I really learned something. The only thing I regret is that I had taught all those kids to read, and I really didn't know what I was doing. But I have had them come to my classroom as college students and, say, I can read out the King, it's okay. So I do feel a little better. But I wish I could have helped some of those other kids, and I know as teachers we always So the history behind this is that as a reader recovery teacher, the first thing they wanted me to do was shift my paradigm. Oh my, I knew how to teach, and I was a bottom-up teacher. Letter names, letter sounds, and I knew that basically inside and out. And the teacher that took my class behind me, she said she was so sad when they changed basils, when they changed reading series. She said, because there went all of my manuals with those wonderful notes. Honey, I had notes everywhere on how to teach everything, what to say here, what to say there. I mean, I lived and died by that basil. But I worked hard, and kids did learn to read. But there was a piece missing, and I knew it. But I didn't know how to get there. So when they started training us, the first thing they did is they taught us those 3 key sources. And I'm thinking, whoa. You gotta have that phonics. You gotta have that phonics. You gotta have that phonics. I mean, they were just, it was tough moving me. And so then, but I was determined to learn more. And so my co-worker's name was Jan Cruz. And we decided, and this is not a reading recovery tool by any means, but it was my visual way of applying what I knew I had to do. And I needed this because the very first thing I did, I was like a buzzard on a fence. The moment a child didn't know a word, fly in, point my little finger to that word and say, you know that, sound that out. Make those sounds, what part do you know? first thing we had to do is get the child to understand that when you come to a hard word, it's your job. It's your job, the child's job. It's his responsibility to do something. And at that point, what everybody knew to do was to start making the sounds they know, right? Well, that's important. But if I really want to focus on comprehension first, then I had to figure out something else to say. I had to think about that. And so we started working with it, and we said, so what are we going to do? What do we want them to do first? Well, first, we want them to think about the story. Then we want them to make the sounds they know. And then we want them to reread it and try something and keep going. So you'll see. So the first thing, prompt 1, is think about the story. Now we said, where does meaning come from? Well, it comes from the picture. It comes from the title. It comes from the content of the story itself, your background knowledge about it. So you want to, the moment the child comes to a word he doesn't know, we want him to think about, what are we reading about? If we're reading about frogs, then the language is going to be something about frogs, okay? So we need to think about all of those words that I know that could maybe be about frogs. Because remember this, a child's oral language vocabulary is much bigger than his sight vocabulary. So they've got this knowledge. I mean, the typical example of this is you've taught anything about dinosaurs. You ever taught a lesson on dinosaurs? Those kids can read everything. You know, and those are huge words. And they can read them. And they do better on hard units like that than on easy stuff. And you're thinking, why? Because of their background knowledge. Because they're bringing that oral language to it. And besides, that's something that they love. So we said the first thing here is we want to think about the story. And for our very, very beginning children, it's easy to say, look at the picture. But what I have found after 10 years of teaching in the classroom is that I have to say, think about the story. Because when my students are tutoring, and they do tutor, it depends on what school site we're at, but in one school site we tutor 3rd graders. The tendency is my students instantly buy into this, and they use it, and then they'll say, look at the picture. Well, look at the picture is really that emergent vocabulary that you would want to use. But as they get a little older, you want them to think about the story. And so that's why I went over that. What brings that message to you? Well, it's going to be the title, your background knowledge, all of those things that we talked about. So think about the story. What are we reading about? And so when we think of our 3 Q sources, that is semantic, syntactic, or graphic Venn diagram, we're going to say that this is syntactic. So first we want them to think about the story. Then we want them to make the sounds they know. And then we want them to reread it. Now, this isn't step 1, and if that doesn't work, then we do step 2, and if that doesn't work, we do step 3. That's not what this is. This is what we teach students every time. That when we read, it has to make sense, look right, sound right. When we read, it has to make sense, look right, sound right. And we do that over and over and over till it's ingrained. And then they realize that it's their job and that's what they have to do. So after they do that, and let's just say that they don't, and I'll go back and I'll use a word and give you an example in a minute, but then we want them to just say something. Okay? How many of you have sat with a little struggling reader and he's just going, say something, try something. You know, and they do, and then they're looking at you. What do they want you to do? Tell them. Right. So, say something and then keep reading. And even if he gets it wrong, how many times have you seen a child read a few more lines down and go, boom, and he runs back up to the front. He says, I know that word, I know that word. Because he's got the meaning and he's got the idea. So, as simple as it sounds, it is a paradigm shift because our first prompt is usually sound it out. So, this is not something that's asking, as a school teacher, asking you to put one more thing on your plate. It's not that kind of thing. It's about being a knowledgeable teacher and knowing that for some children, they need a different prompt. They need a different idea. They need something different. And this just simply works. But it's a hard buy-in. I have people tell me all the time, no, that doesn't work. But my students use it every semester. And some are more successful than others because some just can't break the habit, even though they haven't been in the classroom yet, of saying, I'll be walking by and I'll hear, sound that out, and then they stop, like, oh my gosh, it's right there. You know, but the point here is that this is just a different way of thinking, okay? I don't know what I did. Thank you, Susan. So glad to meet you.
I think all I did was, there,
What did you
go
do?
back, I just go back.
Okay. I'll try to do next. All right. So, our job as classroom teachers is to give our students strategies that develop self-extending systems that empower students to do something, to know something. And it takes them one step beyond that letter-sound relationship. So before we talk about it, let me go back and just give you an example. So if the word is boat, and the child doesn't know the word boat. Let me back up just a little bit. When you are teaching the hand strategy to students, you always teach it on words they already know. And that is true with everything you teach. So no matter what skill, what strategy you're teaching, go back and teach it easy. So if you've got a third grader and you're teaching predicting outcomes, use some first grade examples. Teach it easy because what do we want students to learn the process. You know, I think a lot of times it's not that students can't do what we want them to do. They don't know what we're asking them to do. You know, because they don't understand the little process, the steps itself. So when we teach this, we want to teach it on words they already know. So, okay, we're going to pretend you don't know this word. And then we take them through the process. And we do several of those before we get to the next. And it's amazing in the 10 weeks that we tutor, how many of those students automatically will start doing it. And you'll see them getting to that point of difficulty, and instead of just sounding it out, maybe they'll glance at the picture, or maybe they'll say, even turn to their tutor and say, you know, this is about, and or the tutor will say, what are you supposed to do? What is your job? Okay, my job is, I have to think about the story. So what is the story about? So the word is boat, and the child's reading, and he comes to the hard word, and the very first thing we want to do is we're going to think, when we talked about this story today, you said that it was going to be about a lot of boats sailing information, and then we'll move forward. Okay, so turn to your partner and just see if you can share this with them and relate it to syntactic, semantic, graphophonic, and syntactic information. Okay? I'll give you a few minutes. Okay, any questions? Pretty simple. And you know, the nice thing about using the hand is that it's there. Okay. So, all right, so we reviewed with the hand. Now, very important that when we are, this is going back to the key sources of information. Semantic, I don't know if you noticed up there it said, under semantic it said, does it make sense? Under graphophonic, does it look right? Under syntactic, it says, does it sound right? Those are prompts that the teacher can use the moment she sees where the child is breaking down. So if he says ship for boat, I would maybe say, well, you know what? That makes sense in this story, but does it look right? Okay? But if he says car for boat, and it's in the water, does that make sense with our story? If he says, I done did it, well, does that sound right? You know, is that the way we say it? Okay, so that's what those were underneath here. I kind of left that out. So what we want to do as teachers is to teach children problem-solving action. We want to be able to do it. And so first, we want to teach it, then we want to prompt it, and then we want to reinforce it. And so I always think that with anything that we do, sometimes we don't spend enough time teaching it. You know, we think we've done it, but I believe that we're in the day and age now of, it's not I do, we do, you do. I think now we're into I do, and then we do, and then you do. You know, I think sometimes we turn them loose a little bit too soon. So very important that when we are teaching our students anything new, that we do make sure that we teach it and spend a lot of time teaching it, and then coming back and being able to prompt them to it. And that's where Vygotsky comes in, you know, providing those verbal prompts that assist students without, you know, so that they come out, they arrive at the answer, you know, and some teachers are just masterful at it. And then reinforcing it through specific and direct praise. So let's think, and I don't know if I have time to go through all of them, but this is this is very common because a lot of children, especially struggling readers, first letter, you know,
Yes, right.
they're gonna say something that pops into their head. So I see a car playing this. Now, what I want you to notice is that with each, this is where we are teaching it, but each one of these provides more support, okay? So we start out with the least bit of support, and then depending on how quickly the child gets it, depends on how much more support we're going to provide, okay? So something didn't make sense, reread this. So he says, I see a car playing in the tree. We get to a stopping point. Now and you feel free to disagree with me, but I'm a firm believer that we don't stop a child every time they make an error. And I know that there's research out there that backs me up, but I also know there's research out there, or at least there are ideas out there that says the child can't read the word wrong, you've got to correct it right then. But with fluency being such an issue, we sort of inhibit that if we're slamming on the brakes every time they make an error, because the first thing we're stopping is stopping them from learning how to self-monitor. You know, and self-monitoring is actually more important than getting the word right, okay? Because they have to at least know it's wrong. And if we don't allow them that opportunity to go a little further, if we're instantly telling them that it's wrong before they ever have time to go on, and I can say that because I was so guilty of it, but this works. So think about it this way. He said, he reads it, we get to a nice stopping point, end of a paragraph, end of a page, wherever it is that you want to stop. You know, something didn't make sense. Would you reread that for me? So instantly, I'm hoping what?
He's gonna catch it.
And what am I teaching him to do right then? I'm focusing on self-monitoring. I'm teaching him that he has to listen for when something doesn't make sense. So, he doesn't get it. Says it wrong again. Well, you said car. Could a car be in a tree? Or does that make sense with our story? And still doesn't get it. Then I may say, you said car, that doesn't make sense in our story. Now, I could also do some visual prompts here too, because I could talk about the end. But the most important thing in this sentence right now is not the fact that he didn't get all the sounds right in cat. The important thing right now is that it didn't make sense and he didn't know it. And that's very